But anyway, this part of the cell membrane has to go into a resting period, so and where it can't conduct a message. So that's more physiology stuff. But what you said about it going in one direction is exactly right. It only goes in one direction down the axon, and it only goes in one direction across the synapse. This whole thing is much more complicated than all that, but it's just stuff for a physiology class, not really for us. So when I talk about the microanatomy of a synapse, really all I'm talking about is the pre-synaptic cell, the postsynaptic cell, the space between them, known as the synaptic cleft. I want you guys to know that a message goes from pre to post.
Well, I guess I don't understand that. I know you were just talking about it. So where, like, if I was gonna look at it in the book somewhere, like instead I didn't have you explaining it, could I look for it? Like, does it say something about pre and post here? Or
Yeah,
is
I'm
it
sure it does.
different
This
way?
book actually has quite a bit of information about the nerve impulse and communication, more than I'm going to test you guys on. But yeah, you could find that stuff in chapter section 13.6, 13.7.
Okay.
But in a nutshell, there is a message that travels in the form of electricity down this cell. The voltage of this cell membrane is more negative on the inside than the outside, and there are factors that modify that and make the inside actually more positive than it was. And when that changes, that change of voltage can spread to other parts of the membrane, so that now down here it becomes more positive, and the next thing you know, down here it's more positive, and that voltage change happens kind of progressively. It spreads along this cell membrane as you go. When that reaches this part of the nerve, there's changes inside that allow the nerve to release chemicals that are contained in these green sacs. These contain neurotransmitter chemicals that can diffuse across the cleft and bind to receptors on the postsynaptic cell. So that is the message, quote unquote, how the message is sent. The message is ultimately results in the release of neurotransmitter. And those neurotransmitters can bind to receptors in the cell membrane of postsynaptic cell. And that binding has some effect on this cell.
Okay.
So that's the message. The message is an electrical signal that's converted into a chemical message, and then ultimately back into electric. But it's the question you just asked is a great example of how I can confuse somebody by saying way too much detail, but I can also confuse somebody by not saying enough.
For sure.
And that's always the tightrope that I try to walk. But for now, and for our purposes right now, that's about the extent of what I would want you guys to know. And that's pretty much 13.7. The events that occur during synaptic communication are kind of like, I thought there was it would be kind of like these bullet points, but all of this to me is really crossing over into the land of physiology, and I just don't think it's right for our class right now. Here's an example of how many synapses are on one particular neuron. It's almost covered. It's almost completely blanketed in axon terminals of other nerves. And this, if there's 20 billion neurons or whatever in our central nervous system, each neuron forms hundreds and hundreds of synapses. And so next thing you know, we're talking about trillions and trillions and trillions of synapses in the human nervous system. So you really start to get the idea of how freaking complex this is. So, we did go into some detail here on these 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 points, and that's kind of what I'm looking for you guys to do. What some people have done with this is, before they print it out, hit enter a bunch of times and give yourself space, and actually make a master study guide by pretty much writing down the bullets of everything I just said on here, and then you've got a couple sheets. You've boiled everything down to a couple sheets. That might be something that would be helpful. And I would also say we have quite a bit of time before the test. If a person did not know all the answers to these questions right now, that's probably okay. But I would say going into next week, I hope you guys are all pretty comfortable with 13, 14, and 15. Because you and me are starting 16 tomorrow in class. At least starting it. Next week we're going to finish 16 and what, 18? Skipping 17, I think. We're skipping 17 and doing 18 quite briefly and 19. So, I mean, next week is going to go 16, 18, 19. And I hope people are not hanging out back here at 13 and 14 by next week because they're going to kind of feel like they're being left in the dust.
I feel that right now.
And that's okay because you're feeling it now, not in 2 weeks from now. Better to feel it now than then. I think you're on pace.